Over the next two videos, we're going to build a custom picker component from scratch. In this video, we're only going to focus on the look and feel of this component. We'll talk about selecting an item in the next video. So let's add a new component called app picker.js. So once again, I'm using app as a prefix because at the time of recording this video, we already have a picker component in the React Native core. So even though it's removed from the documentation, it's not removed from the repository. So delete. Now this component should be very similar or identical in terms of the look and feel to our text input component. So to save time, I'm going to go to app text input, copy all the code here, and then paste it to our new file. Next, we need to rename this component to app picker. So we press F2 and type app picker. Now, we should remove this text input and replace it with a text component. So I'm going to render an app text. Once again, VS Code didn't import this, so let's import it on the top. It's a bit painful, I know. We import app text from the current folder. Okay. Now, what should we render here? We should render either the selected value or a placeholder. For now, we're just going to render a placeholder, and we're going to get this as a prop. So let's add a new prop, placeholder. Now let's test our implementation up to this point. So we're going to go to app.js and put a text input next to a picker to make sure they look identical. So save the changes. We go to app.js. Let's import app picker. I'm going to give it a placeholder, let's say category. Right after that, I'm going to add an app text input. Auto import didn't work, so let's import this manually. Okay. Let's set the placeholder to email. Okay. Here's what we get. They look pretty good to me. Let's give them an icon. So I'm going to set the icon of the app picker to apps and the icon of text input to email. That look pretty good. Now for this picker component, we need to add a chevron to the right side. So we should make the text component grow and take all the available free space. How do we do that? Using the flex property. So back to app picker. Let's copy these few lines to add a chevron icon. So we add that right after our text component. Now we're going to set the name to chevron down. We're going to use the same size and color, but here we don't need any styles because earlier we defined the style to apply a right margin over here. We don't need that margin for the chevron icon. So let's remove the style. Now we give our text component a style. We set it to styles.text. And this is where we set flex to 1. So text is an object with flex property set to 1. Take a look. This is what we get. Looks pretty good to me. In the next video, we're going to take this to the next level. So when we tap on this component, we see a modal box with a list of items to select from. So here's our picker component. Now, when the user taps on this component, we should display a modal box with a list of items to choose from. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to display a modal box. We'll talk about displaying the list of items in the next lesson. So first, we should wrap everything with a touchable component so we can handle the onPress event. That is very easy. We have done that many times before. So in this case, I'm going to wrap this with a touchable without feedback because I think that makes more sense in this context. Because when we tap on a picker, the modal should appear. So I don't want to have a separate visual effect for tapping. Now, once again, we have two implementations of this component. One implementation is in React Native Gesture Handler. The other is in React Native. So let's import that. Now, let's put this at the end. Okay. So here's our touchable component. Let's handle the onPress event. At this point, we want to show a modal. Showing a modal is super easy. After this touchable component, we add a modal component This component is defined in React Native. And in this case, VS Code can automatically import this. So let's go with that. Now this component has a prop called visible. We bind this to a Boolean state variable. So if we set it to true, the modal will be visible. If we set it to false, the modal will disappear. Now, before we do that, note that we have a compilation error here. Because we are returning two components from our function component, we are returning a modal and a touchable without feedback. As you know, in React, we can only return a single component, not multiple components. So we need to wrap these two components, this touchable and the modal, inside a React fragment, like this. Now the compilation error is gone. So let's save the changes. The code is perfectly reformatted. We can also simplify this code. So instead of explicitly typing react.fragment, we can type an empty pair of angle brackets. This makes our code a little bit cleaner. So let's remove react.fragment over here. Good. Now I want to bind this to a Boolean state variable. So we have to use the state hook to declare a state variable. So we call useState. We initialize our variable to false. Now we destructure this array. We call our variable modal visible, and the function to update it, set modal visible. All our building blocks are ready. Now we have to combine them. So when we tap on this touchable component, in this function, we call set modal visible and give it true. This will make the modal appear. Now, here we bind visible to modal visible. I also like to apply a nice animation here. So we can set animation type to one of these values, slide, none, and fade. I'm going to use slide. You'll see that in a second. Now in this modal, I'm going to add a button. This is just a regular React Native button, purely for testing. With this button, we're going to close the modal. So we set its title to close. Here we handle the onPress event. And in this function, we call set modal visible and give it false. Now let's test our implementation. So save the changes. Take a look. We tap on this. Our modal appeared, but the close button is behind the notch on iPhone. So to solve this problem, let's wrap this button with a screen component. So screen, I don't know why VS Code doesn't like my screen component. So auto importing doesn't work here. So we go to the top and manually import the screen component from the current folder. Okay, let's try it one more time. Now the close button is here. Let's tap it. The modal disappeared. Let's try it one more time. So when I tap on this, the modal will slide from the bottom of the screen. Take a look. Here's the slide effect. Okay, so our modal is working. Next, we're going to display the list of picker items. Now, when we tap on this picker, we should see the list of items. To implement this, we should give our app picker a list of objects to render in its modal. So here in app.js, outside of our function component, I'm going to define an array of objects called categories. This is purely for testing. We're going to throw away this code very soon. So let's add an object here. Let's assume that every object in this array should have at least two properties. A label that we display to the user, like furniture, and a value that we use under the hood, like when we call the server. So here we use a numeric value. Now let's duplicate this and change the value and label for each item. I'm going to call the second item clothing and the third one cameras. Now we should pass the categories to our app picker. So we give it a new prop, items, and set it to categories. Now let's go ahead and implement this. So here in app picker, I'm going to add a new prop here, items. And by the way, it's a good practice to sort these props. This makes our code a little bit cleaner and more readable. So I'm going to add items right here. So we have a proper order. Also, right now we don't need other props because it's grayed out. So let's delete it and clean up our code. So we have the items prop. Now, here's our modal. We should render the items in a flat list. So right after the button, let's add a flat list. Once again, we have two implementations, one in React Native gesture handler, the other in React Native. So let's import that. Now here we should set 3 props. Do you remember? The first one is data, which we set to items. The second one is key extractor. We set this to a function for uniquely identifying each object. So item goes to item.value. This returns a number, so we have to convert it to a string. And finally, we set render item to a function. As I told you before, this function has an argument. We destructure it right away and pick the item property. Now, what should be rendered here? Well, we don't really have a proper component for this purpose, so I'm going to create a new component. Let's add a new file called picker-item.js. Now we create a component. We should be able to tap on this item, so let's start with the touchable component. Here I'm going to use touchable opacity. Now inside this, we're going to add an app text. Now we need to render the label here. We should get it as a prop. So let's destructure this argument and get the label to render it right here. Next, we should handle the onPress event. Now what should be right here? Well, we want this component to be reusable. So what should happen when we tap an item should be decided by the consumer of this component, not here. So we need a second prop called onPress. And here we simply delegate to the function that is passed from the outside. Okay, save. Now back to our app picker. Let's finish rendering an item. So here we render our picker item component. Here we should set the label. So I set the label to item.label. We should also handle the onPress event. For now, let's just log something on the console. So I'm going to log the item that we're rendering. Okay. Now let's test our implementation. So we tap on this. We have the list of items. We need some styling. We're going to get back to this in a second, but let's test the tapping. So tap, and here's the item that I tapped on. Beautiful. Now let's fix the styling issue. So back to the picker item component. I just noticed that this touchable opacity is imported from React Native gesture handler. I'm not familiar with this, so let's use the one defined in React Native. We should also import the style sheet module. Here we create our style object. For our text, let's give it a padding of 20 pixels. And then we set style to styles.text. Let's test our implementation. So tap. Okay, we have some spacing. Looks good. So now when we select an item, this modal should be closed and the currently selected item should be displayed in the picker. We'll do that next. To handle selections, we're going to treat this component like other input components. So in this component, we should have a state variable that holds the currently selected item in our picker. So let's use the state hook to declare this variable. I'm going to call this category, and the function to update it, set category. Now we should give this picker a couple new props. So the first one is selected item. We set this to category. And the second one is onSelect item. So this is the event that this component raises when the user selects an item. So here we get the item and call set category with it. This is the same pattern we use with the text input and switch components, right? So now let's go ahead and implement these two props. Save the changes here. We go to app picker. Here we add onSelect item and selected item. Now, the first thing we need to change is this line over here. So currently we're always rendering the placeholder. So we should change the logic here. If the selected item is defined, we're going to render its label. Otherwise, we're going to render the placeholder. That was the first change. Now the second change. Down below, when the user taps on an item, instead of console.log, there are two things we need to do. I'm going to write these two statements inline here, but we could also define them in a separate function. Not a big deal. It's only 2 lines of code. So here first, we should close the modal. So we call set modal visible and give it false. Then we should raise the onSelect item event. So onSelect item, we call this function and give it the item that was selected. As simple as that. Now let's test our implementation. Save the changes. So let's select the category, furniture. Now we have furniture here. Beautiful. What if we change it to clothing? Everything works perfectly. Now let's test initializing this picker. So in app.js, I'm going to initialize our state variable to categories of 0. Let's see if it works. So by default, the first item is selected. So our picker is ready. Now we could spend more time and make this screen pretty. We could replace the close button with an icon, but these details are irrelevant now because we're focusing on building forms. We can always come back and improve this screen. For now, it's doing its job. So let's move on. In this section, we're going to talk about building forms. So we're going to take our app to the next level and create 3 new screens: the login screen, the register screen, and a screen for adding a new listing. As part of this, you will learn how to build forms with a popular library called Formake, how to implement data validation using another popular library called Yup, and how to build reusable form components. I'm super excited about this section. I hope you are too. So let's jump in and get started. So all our input components are ready. Now let's start building our login form. So in the screens folder, let's add a new file called loginscreen.js. Here's our function component. Now let's import the stylesheet module from React Native and create our styles object right away. Okay. Now in this component, first we're going to add a screen component and import it on the top. So import screen from, we go up to our components folder and load the screen module. Now inside this screen component, first we need to render our logo. So here we need an image component. I'm going to set the source to require. We go up to our assets folder and load logo-red.png. I gave you this file earlier in the course. So here's the source. We should give it a bunch of styles. So let's set the style to styles.image. Well, styles.logo. Now let's define the styles. So I'm going to set the width to 80 pixels, the height to 80 pixels as well. We want to put the logo in the center of the horizontal axis. So here we set align self to center, because by default, the flex direction of our container, that is the screen component, is set to vertical axis. So that is our primary axis. And as you know, with align items, we can align items along the horizontal axis. So here we're overriding the alignment for this particular component. Okay. Now we want to add some margin on the top and some margin below this logo. Okay. So let's test our implementation. Save the changes. We go to app.js. We're going to remove all the code here and render our login screen. So I'm going to throw away all these categories. I told you this is just code for testing. So here we just need to return our login screen. Okay. Now over here, our logo is in the right place. Beautiful. Now below this, we're going to add 2 input fields and a button. So back to our login screen. Here I'm going to add app text input. Now we should set a bunch of props here. The first one is placeholder. We set this to email. The second one is icon. I want to put that before placeholder. So all these props are sorted. So I'm going to set the icon to email. We should also set auto capitalize to none. So with this, the first letter of our email is not going to get capitalized. Okay. We should also set autocorrect to false because we don't want iOS or Android to correct our spelling. So what else do we need here? Next, we need to set keyboard type. Now, this is one of the problems with custom components. We don't have IntelliSense here. So if I press Control and space, we don't see anything. So when working with custom components, always have the documentation ready. So here's the text input component. Let's take a look at the keyboard type prop. So I'm going to set this to email address. This makes it easier to type an email address. So back to our code. We're going to set the keyboard type to email-address. And finally, the last prop I'm going to set here is text content type. This only works on iOS. When we set this to email address, iOS will be able to autofill this field from the keychain. So this is our first input field. After that, we need another input field for our password. So what props do we need here? Well, first we're going to set auto capitalize to none because we don't want iOS or Android to automatically capitalize the first letter. Next, we set autocorrect to false. The reason is obvious. For the icon, I'm going to use the lock icon. We're going to set the placeholder to password. We're going to set the text content type prop, which only works on iOS, to password. Again, with this, iOS will be able to autofill this field from the keychain. And finally, we're going to set secure text entry to true. Or as I told you before, we can use the shorthand syntax, so we can only type the prop name. So once again, note that I have sorted these props. This makes it easier to read this code. If you're looking for a particular prop, we can quickly see if it's in the list or not. Now let's add our login button. So right after that, we're going to add app button. I'm going to set the title to login. And for onPress, for now, we just want to log something to the console. But what are we going to log? Well, we need to add two state variables to our form. These variables represent the values in these input fields. So once again, we're going to use our state hook. Use state. We're going to declare two state variables. The first one is username or email. That's what I used here. And the second one is password. Password and set password. Let's make sure that auto import worked here. There you go. So useState is imported from React. Beautiful. Now we need to handle the unchanged text event of these input fields. So whenever the user types something here, we update our state variables. So right after keyboard type, I'm going to set onChange. Look, again, we don't have IntelliSense. So that's the problem with this custom components. Hopefully this will improve in the future. So onChange text, here we pass a function that takes the text, and here we call set email to this text. One more time. OnChange text, we set it to a function, and here we call set password. Okay. Finally, when the user tries to log in, we want to log the email and password. So email and password. This is purely for testing. So let's test our app. Here's what we get. It looks pretty good to me. The only problem we have here is the lack of padding. We'll fix that in a minute. But before we do that, let's type something here. So programmingwithmosh@gmail.com and password is 123. So log in. Now look at the terminal. So we have the email and the password. Beautiful. So finally, let's add a style for our container. We're going to give this a padding of 10 pixels. And then we're going to apply this on the top. So here's our screen. We set the style to styles.container. Let's have one more look. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this. Next, we're going to talk about a popular library for building forms. So here we have a simple form with only 2 input fields. But as the number of input fields in our form increases, our code starts to get more complex. For every field, we have to declare a state variable, And then we have to write code to validate that variable. All of this can become a bit painful. This is where we use a popular library called Formic. I love their tagline, build forms in React without the tears. So Formic takes care of all the complexity of building forms. It keeps track of form state, and it gives us validation out of the box. It works with React and React Native, so chances are you're already familiar with it. In this lesson, we're going to have a quick look at Formic because it is possible that the next React Native project you get is already implemented with Formic. It's very popular, so you should know what it is and how it works. In this lesson, we're just going to cover the basics. If you want to learn more, you need to read Formic's documentation. So here in the terminal, let's install Formic version 2.1.4. This is the latest version at the time of recording this video. If you're coding along with me, use the same version so there are no surprises while you're coding along. Okay, let's go with that. Formic is installed, beautiful. Now, in our login screen on the top, we should import Formic from Formic. Note that this is not a default export. It's a named export, so we have to wrap it in between braces. Now, the first time you use Formic, you may get slightly confused, but trust me, this is only the first time. Once you start using Formic and get hang of it, you're going to love it. You will use it in every project. So let's see how we can use the Formic component. So after our image, I'm going to add a Formic component. Now, this component has a couple of props we have to set. The first one is initial values. We set this to an object with initial values for our form. So here we have two input fields, email and password. Let's set email and password to an empty string. Initial values, okay? The second prop we have to set is onSubmit. We set this to a function that determines what should happen when we submit the form. So in the future, we're going to call the server and send our credentials. For now, we're just going to log something to the console. So here we pass a function. This function takes an object that represents the values in the form. Now we get that and log it to the console. Okay? Now, inside the Formic component, we should add braces because here we should pass a function. So this is what I was telling you earlier. The syntax is slightly unfamiliar. So instead of passing direct children here, we should pass a function. This function has an argument. We can destructure it and pick a couple of important properties. One of them is handle change. The other is handle submit. There are more properties. You're going to learn about them as we go through the course. So these two are functions that Formic gives us. And with this, we can keep track of form state and submit it. Let me show you. So our function should return a JSX expression. So here I use parentheses so we can break down our JSX into multiple lines. Now, a function in React, as you know, should return a single element or a single component. But here we have multiple elements. We have multiple components, two input fields, and a button. So we should wrap this inside a fragment or empty angle brackets. Now, inside this, we're going to move our input fields and buttons. So let's select all the code up to this point, cut, and then paste it over here. Save. Let's see what we have. So here's our Formic component. It has two props, initial values and onSubmit. Inside this, we have braces because we're passing a function. Over here, we have destructured the argument of this function. So we pick two properties, handle change and handle submit. And then we return a JSX expression. Our JSX contains a fragment and our input fields. So where are we going to use these functions? We're going to use handle change right here when we subscribe to the change text event of our input field. So instead of this function, we're going to call handle change and specify the name of our input field, in this case, email. So I'm using email here because that is the property I used when supplying the initial values. Okay. Now, similarly, for our password field, we're going to replace this function with handle change and give it password. And finally, for our button, we're going to set onPress to handle submit. This will cause the form to be submitted. Okay. When the form is submitted, we're going to end up right here. This is the function that gets called when the form is submitted. Now let me show you something. Look, these two state variables are no longer needed because Formic tracks our form state. This is one of the benefits of Formic. So if you had a form with 5 fields, without Formic, we would have to create 5 state variables to track our form state. With Formic, we don't have to do that. We let Formic track our form state, okay? So let's delete these 2 lines. That also means we don't need the state hook anymore. Okay, so our code is cleaner. We're done with the first step. Next, we're going to talk about validation. To implement validation, we're going to use a popular library called Yup. There's another popular library called Joy. I talked about that in my React and Node courses. But the reason we're using Yup in this course is that Formic has built-in support for data validation with Yup. Let me show you. So let's install Yup. Okay, so the version I'm using is 0.28.5. Now, in our login screen on the top, let's import everything as Yup from Yup. Okay, now outside of our function component, we're going to define a validation schema, an object that determines all the rules for validating our form. So let's define a constant called validation schema. And by the way, the reason I'm defining this outside of our function component is that we don't want this object to be redefined every time our function gets re-rendered. So here we use Yup. Yup has a few different methods for validating different types of objects. For example, we have the string method, we have number, we have object, and so on. So here we call the object method and then call the shape method to define the shape of this object. So here we pass an object, and in this object, we add the properties that represent our input fields. So we have this email field. Now, here we use yup.string because this is a string field. This should be required. So here we call the required method. Now, this should also be an email. It should be a valid email address. So with this method, we don't have to write a regular expression to validate the email field. We can chain these validation methods to build a complex schema. This is the beauty of Yup and Joy. So here we can optionally call the label method as well, because the name of this field is email with a lowercase e, but when displaying validation errors, I want to use an uppercase e. So this is why we use the label method. Now let's define the rules for our password field. So password is also a string. It's required, and let's say it should be at least 4 characters. Here we also have the max method. We have matches, so we can match this against a regular expression. You can read about these methods on the Yup documentation. So let's give this a label as well. We're going to use password with a capital P. Here's our validation schema. Now all we have to do is to set the validation schema prop to the schema we define. Formic takes care of everything for us. So finally, we have to display validation messages. So right after this input field, I'm going to add an app text. Auto import is not working, so let's import it on the top. Import app text from, we go up to components and load this module. Back to our validation message. So here's our app text. Now, how do we get the error? Well, earlier we talked about these 2 properties, handle change and handle submit. There is another property we can pick called errors. This is an object that contains all the errors in our form. For every field, we have a key value pair. So using this, we can render the errors for the email field. As simple as that. Now, here I'm going to apply an inline style as a temporary solution. I want to set the color of the validation error to red. Later, we'll refactor this and put this inside a reusable component. For now, let's not worry about it. Now, to save time, I'm going to copy this line and paste it after our password field. So here we want to display the errors for the password field. Now let's test our app. So here's our login form. If I press the login button, look, we have the validation messages. Now, the moment I start typing, this validation message gets updated. So if I type A, because A is not a valid email, we get a different error. Email must be a valid email. And note that email is spelled with a capital E. This is because of the label that we assign. So I'm going to set this to programmingwithmosh@gmail.com. Now the error is gone. So for the password field, if I type just one character, we get a different error. Password must be at least 4 characters. So as you see, validation with Formic and Yup is super easy. Now let's create a reusable component for rendering error messages. So in our components folder, we add a new file called error message. Here's our component. In this component, we want to render an app text. So let's import it on top. We should import it from the current folder. We also need to apply a style. So I'm going to import the style sheet component. Next, we add an app text. Now here we want to render the error message. So let's destructure this props, pick the error, and render it here. Now, what if the error is empty or undefined? We'll end up with an empty app text component. So to improve this, we can check to see if error is undefined, we can return null. So we're not going to return an empty app text component, okay? Finally, let's apply a style here. So we create our style sheet and set the style for our arrow. Here I'm going to set the color to red. And the last step is to set the style to styles.arrow. Save the changes. Now we're going to use this on our login screen. So I'm going to replace app text with error message. Thank God. Auto import is working. So let's give it the error. We're going to set this to errors.password. And one more time, I'm going to replace this with error message for the email field. So errors.email. That's all we had to do. Now let's test the app and make sure everything works. We got this error. Objects are not valid as a React child. This is coming from error message implementation in Formic Connect. So the reason this happened was the bloody auto import feature. So it imported the error message from Formic because in Formic we have a component with the same name. This is the reason I told you that it's best to name your components with a prefix or something so they're distinguished from the components in third-party libraries. So let's remove this and import error message from the components folder. Now, once again, I would like to sort this. So I'm going to put app button on top. Then we have app text input, error message, and screen. So anyone looking at this code, they can quickly tell if a component is imported or not. Save the changes and let's reload the app. Here's our form. Validation works. Let's type something here. Beautiful. So our validation is working, but we have a small problem in this form. Let me show you. I'm going to manually reload the app. Now, this time I'm not going to tap on this button. I just want to type something in the email field. Look, we have 2 validation errors. I haven't touched the password field, so why should I see this error? This is really easy to fix. We need to handle the unblur event of this input field, and there we need to mark this field as touched. Now, we should show the error message only if the field has been touched and it has an error. This is really easy to fix. So here's our input field. We need to handle the unblur event. We set this to a function. In this function, we need to mark this field as touched. How? Well, over here, we're going to pick another property called setFieldTouched. We also have setFieldError. If you want to programmatically assign an error to a field, we also have setFieldValue. With this, we can programmatically set the value of a field. We'll look at this in the future. So let's pick this property. Now, in this function, we call setFieldTouched and specify the name of the field. That is the email field. Now, we want to render this error message only if the field has been touched and it has an error. There are 2 ways to do this. One way is to use conditional rendering in React. So we wrap this in braces. Now we need a Boolean expression. We need to know if this field has been touched. To detect that, once again, we're going to add a property here. Touched. This is an object similar to the errors object. So for every field in this form, it has a key value pair. So here we can check if touched, that email is truthy, then we're going to render the error message component. That's one way. I personally don't like this approach in this context. I prefer to give this component a new prop like visible and set it to touch.email. So let's go to our error message component, give it a new prop, visible. Now, if visible is false or we don't have an error, we're going to return null. So nothing is going to get rendered. Okay, save. Now back to our login screen. I'm going to remove the conditional rendering and set visible to touched.email. Really simple. Now let's make the same change to our password field. So one more time, we handle the unblur event in this function. We mark this field as touched, the password field. And finally, we display the error message only if the field has been touched. So visible equals touched.password. Okay, let's test our app one more time. So I'm going to manually reload. Now let's type something here. No errors. But if I leave this field, I get this error. Because at this point, the unblur event is raised. So the field is marked as touched and our validation error gets displayed. There is a problem with the current implementation. For every input field, we have to handle the unblur and unchange events. And then we have to add an error message component. Here we have to set the error to errors.whatever. And visible, we have to set it to touch.whatever. Now we have to repeat the same pattern for every input field in this form. This is bad. This is duplication. So over the next few videos, I'm going to show you a few refactoring techniques. We're going to extract a few reusable components, and the end result is going to be absolutely beautiful. You're going to love it. Now, quite frankly, these techniques I'm going to show you, you don't find them in other courses. So pay close attention. Now, how can we solve this problem? Well, we need to encapsulate this input field and its error message inside a reusable component. So instead of adding these two components for every input field, we're going to use that new component. Let me show you. So here in the components folder, let's add a new file. We're going to call this app form fill. I will explain why I'm choosing this name in a second. Now we create a function component. Now back to our login screen. I'm going to grab this input field and its error message. So let's copy these fill lines and paste them over here. Now before we do that, because we're copying two components, we need to wrap them inside a fragment because we can return only a single element or a single component here, right? So let's paste that code. Okay, now we have to bring in a few components. So we should import app text input because we're using it over here. We should also import the error message component. Let's do that as well. Import error message. Now to make this reusable, we're going to get rid of some of these props. For example, auto capitalize doesn't apply to every input field. So we don't need this, but I'm not going to delete it yet. I just want to comment it out. Similarly, we don't need autocorrect, icon, and keyboard type. So comment. We're going to keep unblur and unchange events. Then we're going to remove placeholder and text content type. Now, here we don't want to hard code email. You want to be able to pass the name as a prop. So I'm going to give this component a prop called name and use that over here. Okay, so I renamed both instances. Now, similarly, when we go to the errors object, we don't want to access the email property. We want to access a property by its name. So here we use the square bracket notation to access the property with this name. Okay, we have to apply the same change here. So touched of name. Okay, now there are a few things we need here. We need the errors object, we need the touched object, as well as these two functions, set field touched and handle change. But how do we get them here? we are not inside a Formic component. So how can we get access to these objects? Very easy. So Formic has a function. We're going to import use Formic context from Formic. So Formic uses React context to pass objects down. If you're not familiar with React context, go watch the last section of my React course. But very briefly, with context, we can pass an object down our component tree without having to drill a property at every level. So we can consume that object anywhere in our component tree. So Formic uses React context to pass these objects down. Now, we can consume those objects inside our custom component. So here we call use Formic context. Now VS Code re-imported this function. This is really annoying. So anyway, we call this function. Now this returns an object. We can destructure that and pick the properties we need. In this case, set field touched, handle change, as well as errors and touched. Okay, so now we shouldn't have any compilation errors. But what about these props? Well, here we're going to use the REST operator to get the other props and put them in a single object. Then we're going to use the spread operator to pass those props to our text input component. This is basic React. We have talked about this before. So let's get rid of these comments. Okay, now we have a reusable form field. So we can go back to our login screen. I'm going to replace this app text input with app form field. Now every form field should have a name property. If we don't set this, we're going to get an error. Now the proper way to handle this is using prop types. We'll talk about that in the future. But for now, let's set the name prop here. So I'm going to set the name to email. Now we no longer need to handle the onBlur and onChange events. We also don't need the error message component either. Similarly, for our password field, we're going to set a name to password. Now let's remove these two lines and the error message. Save the changes. So let's test our app. All right, we get this error. Objects are not valid as a React child. Once again, this is coming from error message implementation in Formic Connect. That happened because in our new component, auto import ended up importing the error message from Formic. We have to replace this with the error message component that we created. So see, that's the problem with having name conflicts. So we're going to import error message from the current folder. Now delete this line, save, and test it one more time. Here's our form. We only see the validation error for the email field because in our login screen, I forgot to replace this with app form field. Let's try it one more time. Both validation errors are there. Beautiful. So we're going to continue with our refactoring. Next, we're going to create a submit button. What is the next thing we want to improve here? Well, every time we add a button, we have to set its onPress prop to handle submit. This is repetitive. Why do we have to do this every time we add a button to our form? So using the technique you learned in the last lesson, we can encapsulate this inside a reusable component. We're going to call that submit button. So in the components folder, let's add a new file. I'm going to call this submit button because Formic doesn't have a component by this name, so we're not going to have name conflicts. Now here we create a function component. Now, back to our login screen. Let's copy this line and paste it over here. Now we should import the app button component. So import app button, good. Now I want to set the title dynamically. So I'm going to give this a new prop called title and use it over here. Now to get the handle submit, we're going to use Formic context one more time. So import Formic context. Okay, it's down here. So here's Formic context. Now let's call this function. It returns an object. So we're going to destructure it straight away and pick the handle submit property, or more accurately, function. Now, save. Back to our login screen. I'm going to replace this with our submit button. So submit button, and we simply set the title to login. That's all we have to do. Now, let me show you something. With these changes, we no longer need any of these objects over here. They're all grayed out. So we can simplify our code and make it cleaner. So I'm going to delete this entire object. Now we have a function with no parameters, okay? Save the changes. Let's test our app. Okay, everything works. In the next lesson, we're going to take this code to the next level and make it even better. The next thing we want to improve here is this weird syntax. I don't like the fact that every time we use formik, we have to pass a function, and then we have to wrap our components with a fragment. This is ugly and unnecessary. Wouldn't that be nicer if we could use this component directly as a child of formik? That's what I'm going to show you in this lesson. So let's add a new component. I'm going to call this app form because formik already has a component called form. This is the same reason I called the other component app form field, because formik has a component called form field. Okay. Now here we create a component. In this component, we want to return the formik component. So let's copy these few lines, paste them over here. Now we close the formik tag. Okay. We want to set this props dynamically. So let's add a few props here. Initial values, onSubmit, and validation schema. Now we're going to replace all these objects with our props. Next we set onSubmit, and then we set validation schema. Beautiful. Now inside this formik component, we should add braces and pass a function, right? Now this function should return a JSX expression, right? So here I add parentheses so I can break this down into multiple lines. Now first we add the fragment, and then inside this fragment, we want to render our children. So what I'm doing here is the steps that we have to follow every time we have to build a form. I'm encapsulating all these details inside a single reusable component. So how do we get the children? We have done this before. We use the children prop and then render it inside this fragment. Okay, save the changes. Now the last thing we have to do is to import the formik component. So let's import formik. Here's formik, good. Now back to our login screen. I'm going to replace this with app form. Now we no longer need this ugly function and this fragment. So let's select our input fields and our submit button. Cut this code. So here's the function that we used to pass to formik. Let's delete that. Now, before we paste our input fields, let's rename this to app form as well. Okay. Now we paste our input fields, save the changes. So look at the end result. We have a form. Inside this form, we have a couple of fields. There is no duplication in our code. There is no unblur, unhandle change, set the error message, all these duplications. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you one extra technique to make this code even better. Now look at our components folder. This folder has been growing. Now we have a mixture of different types of reusable components. Some of these components are for building forms, some are for building lists, and so on. So now it's time to reorganize these components into different namespaces. So here I'm going to add a new folder called forms. I'm going to move all the components for building forms inside this folder. But I'm going to move components one by one. And this is what I recommend you to do, because moving files and folders around in VS Code is not very reliable. Sometimes VS Code updates the references, sometimes it doesn't. Why? I'm not sure. So we're going to move components one by one and make sure our app works. The first component I'm going to move is app form. Let's move it over here. VS Code open login screen, and as you can see, this file is in the edit mode because VS Code updated the reference to the app form component. So now it's inside the forms folder. Good. So save the changes. Now our app is still working. Beautiful. Let's move another component. So next I'm going to move app form field. Okay, in this case, VS Code didn't update the reference to this component. So we have to manually add that over here. Save. Let's look at our app. So this is the error you see all the time when you move files around. Undefined, unable to resolve module, app text input from app form field. So that means in this file, in app form field, we have a reference to app text input, and that is not updated. So let's go to app form field. So we have a reference to app text input. Now we have to go one level up because app form field is inside the forms folder, right? Save. Let's reload the app. This is another error you may see from time to time. Requiring unknown module 18. If you're sure the module exists, try restarting Metro. So we have to stop Expo and restart it. Okay, Metro is restarted, so let's reload the app. Okay, now we see the actual error message. Once again, we have a reference error. So unable to resolve module, error message in app form field. So in this file, we have a reference to error message, and now we need to update the reference. So here in app form field.js, this is our reference. We need to go one level up. Save. Let's reload one more time. Okay, the error is gone. So to keep this from getting repetitive, I'm going to pause the recording and move a few other components inside the forms folder. You already know the technique. So if you're coding along with me, try moving these components and solve the errors on your own. So I've moved 4 components inside the forms folder. We have app form field, error message, and submit button. I chose not to move app button and app picker inside this folder because we might have a button without having a form. So I chose to keep these components where they are. But this is subjective. There is no right or wrong. If you prefer to move them in the forms folder, that's totally fine. Now let's take this to the next level. So in the forms folder, let's add an index file. So index.js. Now we're going to import all these components and re-export them. With this, we can easily import our form components in other components. You're going to see that in a second. So there are 2 ways to import and re-export a component. Here's one way. We can import a component like app form from the current folder and then export it in an object. So we export an object and add app form to that object. As another example, we can import app form field from the current folder and then add it to this object. So this is a 2-step process. There is another way. We can combine these 2 steps into a single step. So we type export. In braces, we type default as. Here we type the name of a component we want to export. Let's say app form. Then we type from. And here we specify the path. So app form. So here's the syntax. Now we can duplicate this to export app form field. From this file, one more time, I'm going to export error message and finally the submit button. Submit button. Okay, we're done. Now let's go to our login screen, the final step. So look, some of those import statements are not used. For example, formic is not used, it's grayed out, so let's delete it. Also, we don't need these 3 components. Let's delete this as well. Now, we can combine these 3 import statements into a single one. Because here we're importing 3 form components. Now, all these components are in a single place. They're inside the forms folder, and we're exporting them from index.js. So here we type import from, we go up to components/forms. We are referencing a folder. Because there is an index.js in that folder, here we can import app form field, and submit button. Now, we no longer need these 3 statements. That's better. Save. So our app is working. If you had difficulty applying these refactorings, you can use the completed source code for this section. So at the beginning of the course, I gave you all the source code for this course. Every section has a begin and end folders. So if you got stuck, don't worry, just use the completed source code and move to the next section. All right, let's talk about our listing edit screen. For this exercise, I decided to type all the code first and then explain it to you because the steps are very repetitive and they involve a lot of typing. So I didn't want to waste your time. So in this video, I'm going to go through what I've done. But once again, you can find the completed source code in the zip file that I gave you at the beginning of the course. So here we're importing 4 components from our forms folder. We have app form field, exactly like before. We have a new component, app form picker. That is a picker that we use inside a form. Let me give you a quick tour of this component. This component is very similar to our form field. So we're using form context to get these objects, errors, set field value, touched, and values. Here we have an app picker and an error message. For our app picker, we're setting 4 props. We set items to the items that we get here as a prop. We're setting onSelect item. This is an event that gets raised when the user selects a value. So here we need to programmatically set the value of this field in formic. So in this function, we get the selected value, which is an object, and then call setFieldValue. We specify the name of the field, which we get as a prop, and the selected value or the selected object. Next, we have the placeholder and the selected item. I'm setting this to values of name. So values is an object that is available in formic, just like the errors and touched objects. It has a key value pair for every field in the form. So this is pretty straightforward. And then we have our error message exactly like before. Now, back to our listing edit screen. Here's my validation schema. So in this form, we have 4 fields. We have title, price, description, and category. Title is a string. It's required. I set the min to 1, so the user has to type at least 1 character. For the number, it's also required. Here I supplied a range of values, so the price has to be between $1 and $10,000. Description is just a string. It's not required. Now, category is an object. It's required, and it's nullable. This is the only tricky part that you had to deal with. Now, here's my list of categories. For this exercise, I just added 3 objects in this array. All these objects have a label and a value, exactly like before. Now, here's my app form. Nothing magical here. The initial values is an object with its 4 properties. Now, title, price, and description, I've set all these properties to an empty string. So even though price is a number, inside the form, it's represented as a string. So I didn't want to initialize this to 0. Otherwise, we would see 0 in our input field. So that is why I set it to an empty string. The category is an object, so it's going to be one of these objects. We either have a category or not. If we don't have a category, this property should be null, okay? Now I accidentally put a breakpoint. Let's remove that. So next we have onSubmit and validation schema, exactly like before. Now inside this form, we have these fields. We have a form field. Here I applied a max length of 255, so the user cannot type more than this number of characters, okay? I gave this field a name. This is used by our form component. And here we have a placeholder. Now for the price field, I set the keyboard type to numeric, so the user can only type a number. I set the max length to 8 because the maximum price we assume for this item is going to be $10,000, right? So we have to count for period and cents. So that is totally 8 characters. Here we should also set a name and placeholder. Next, we have our app form picker. Here we have 3 props, items which we set to our categories, as well as name and placeholder. And finally, we have another form field for our description. I made this field multi-line and set the number of lines to 3. This only works on Android. So on Android, our description box looks bigger. On iPhone, it looks exactly like other input fields, but as we type here, the text box starts to grow, okay? So that's pretty much it. Now, one last tip before I finish this video. If you don't like these names, if you think this is too long, you can give it an alias. So on the top, we can give this an alias. We can call it form field, and we can call this one picker. Now, we can go back to our form and rename these to form field. And this one is going to be picker. So that makes our code a bit cleaner. It looks nicer. The problem with this approach though is in every form, we have to apply these aliases. The other approach is to rename these components, but the problem with that is name conflict, which I talked about before. So I leave it up to you to choose the approach that you prefer. Now let's fix the problem with this placeholder. As you can see, it's darker than the placeholder in our other input fields. So we go to our app picker component. Let's find where we are rendering the placeholder. It's right here. Now, with this implementation, we are either rendering the selected item or the placeholder inside this app text. Now, the placeholder should be medium gray, whereas the selected item should be dark gray. So here we need two different app text components with different styles. So let's write an expression like this. If selected item exists, we're going to render an app text. Here we render selected item.label. And we set the style of this component to the same style as before, styles.text. Okay. Otherwise, if selected item does not exist, we're going to render an app text for our placeholder. Let me save the changes so you can see clearly. So if selected item exists, we're going to render this app text. Otherwise, we're going to render this other app text. So here we want to set the style to a different style, like styles.placeholder, which doesn't exist. So we have to go and create it in a second. But before we do that, let's remove this app text. Okay. Now, down below, here's the style for our text. Let's define a style for our placeholder. Well, technically, I should put this before T, right? Now here we set the color to default styles. This already exists in this module. So let's go to colors.medium gray. We should also set flex to 1. So the placeholder grows and take the available free space. Take a look. So save. Okay, that looks better, but it's still darker than the placeholder of these other fields. The reason this is happening is that we didn't set the color of the placeholder in the text input component. So this is the default color. So let's go to app text input. Here's our text input component. This is where we need to set the placeholder color. So placeholder text color. We set this to default styles.colors.medium. Again, this is the benefit of having a color palette. We can reuse these colors in different components. So save. And here's the final result. Beautiful. We have reached the last section of the first part of my React Native series. In this section, I want you to imagine that you just got a new job as a React Native developer. So you're given a new project built by someone else. Now you have to fix a number of issues and implement a new feature, just like a real-world scenario. So download the PDF I've attached to this video. That includes the exercises for this section. These exercises are all important for you, especially the very last one. So go ahead, do the exercises. When you're done, come back, see my solution. So here's our messages screen. We want to improve this list item and add a chevron over here. So let's go to listitem.js. On the top, we should import material community icons. So import from expo/vector icons. We're going to import material community icons. Also, I noticed that touchable opacity is not used anymore. So let's delete this. We should also move this import statement to the top. So all the import statements from third-party libraries are in a single place, okay? And here we have the import statements from our code. Good. Now, here we have this details container. This is where we render the title and the subtitle. So right after the details container, we should add an icon. That is very easy. So material community icons. I'm going to set the name to chevron-right and the size to 25. Let's save the changes and see what happens. So here's what we get. We need to move this to the right side. How? we should make this details container grow and take the available free space. So let's look at the styles for the details container. Here we need to set flex to 1. Save. Okay, looking better. Now we need to vertically align this in the center. So let's look at the main container. This is the container for each list item. Here we have set the flex direction to row. So our primary axis is the horizontal axis. We want to align this across the vertical axis, which is the cross axis. So here we set align items to center. Take a look. Looks pretty good to me. Finally, I want to change the color. Currently it's pure black. It's too strong. So I want to change it to medium gray. So back to our icon. I'm going to set the color to, here we have our colors palette. So let's use the medium gray. Okay. And this is what we get. I'm pretty happy with this. So let's move on to the next task. The next thing we want to address is long text. This is one of the issues that happens frequently in mobile apps. So always test your components with long text. As you can see, our list item looks terrible if we give it a long title or subtitle. So to fix this, let's go to list item. So this is where we're rendering our title. We have to set the number of lines to 1, so our text gets truncated. That's very easy. So the text component in React Native has this prop called number of lines. We set this to 1. Let's test the result. Nothing happened because we're not passing this prop to the underlying text component. So let's go to app text. So here's our text component. As you can see, here we're only supporting 2 props, children and style. So if somewhere we pass any additional props to this component, these props are not going to get applied to the underlying text component. To solve this problem, we need to use the rest operator to get the other props and then apply them over here. We have done this before many times. So here we add braces and use the spread operator to apply these props. Okay, save the changes. So our title, which is in dark gray, is now in 1 line. And as you can see, it's truncated over here. So the rest of this text is our subtitle. We have to apply the same change to the subtitle. So back to the list item. This is where we're rendering the subtitle. For this, I'm going to set the number of lines to 2. We want to have a bit more description. So save. And here's the final result. That looks pretty good. Now we have the same problem in our card component, but I'm not going to fix it in this video because the steps are very repetitive. So let's move on to the next task. So I added some real text to make the screen more interesting. Now note that when I pull down this list to refresh it, we're going to see a cutoff around here. We had this problem before, but it's back. Take a look. Did you see the cutoff? Let me explain why this is happening. So we go to our screen component. Earlier, we only had this safe area view. To solve the problem, we set the flex to 1. So the safe area view can grow and take all the available free space. But later in the course, we added this view because at the time of recording this course, safe area view doesn't support horizontal padding. So we added this view as a workaround. Now here's the problem. This view is not growing to take all the available free space. It grows enough to fit its content. That is the default behavior of views. So a technique that I personally use to troubleshoot these issues is applying a background color. Let me show you. So for our safe area view, here I'm going to pass a temporary object. I just want to apply a background color of yellow. Now similarly, for this view, we're going to apply a background color of, let's say, orange. Let's see what we get. So I'm going to reload the app. Look, we don't have any orange area here because this view is growing to fit its content. That is the flat list. Now, what if we set flex to 1? Take a look. Now our view has grown to take all the available free space. So when I pull this down, we don't have that cutoff. Okay? So to solve this problem, let's define a new style object, view, Here we set flex to 1. And then I'm going to get rid of this object. So in this array, first we should apply the styles in this file. So styles.view. And then we apply any style that is passed from the outside. Okay. And finally, let's get rid of this object. All right. Here's the final result. Let's test our app one more time. So I'm going to reload and then pull down. The cutoff is gone. So I figured out why auto import wasn't working on this machine where I'm recording these videos. I already explained this once before in the course, but I'm going to repeat it one more time in case you missed that video. So look here in app component. If I try to import app text or any of the components, they don't come up. So to solve this problem, first you need to look at the extensions you have installed in VS Code. Make sure you don't have any extensions for auto importing files. On this machine where I'm recording these videos, I had a couple of extensions for auto importing files. I installed these years ago before VS Code implemented this feature. So first I uninstalled those extensions, and then I did some research. I figured out that we have to add a special file in the root of this project. So here we should add jsconfig.json. Make sure to spell it properly. This tells VS Code to treat this as a JavaScript project, because by default, VS Code treats this as a TypeScript project, even though we don't have any TypeScript files here. So here we add a configuration object and set exclude to the node modules folder. This tells IntelliSense to exclude this folder. So if you don't apply this and your project is too big, you may encounter some performance problems in IntelliSense. Now look, we can look up app text or any of the components in this project. Now, if this still doesn't work on your machine, just restart VS Code and hopefully everything should be fine. The next thing we want to improve is the width of these input fields. It doesn't make sense to always use 100%. For example, for our price field, we only have 8 characters, so we shouldn't have such a long text box. This is bad UI, but this is really easy to fix. First, we go to our listing edit screen. So here's our price field. We should be able to set a width of, let's say 120 pixels here. Now save. Nothing happens because this component doesn't have support for dynamic width. So let's go to app form field. Here we add a new prop width. Now in this component, we are using our app text input. So we should pass this width to this component as well. We set width to width. Now the final step, we go to app text input, give it a new prop. Now here we have a container, and earlier we set the width of this container to 100%. We don't want to hard code this value. So I'm going to remove this style. Now, here we should pass an array. The first object is our container object. Then we add another object where we set the width. Now, if we don't specify the width, we should use 100% as the default value. So save. Okay, this looks better. Now we have to make the same changes to our picker component. So first we go to our listing edit screen. This is where we're using the picker. So I'm going to set the width to 50%. Okay. Now we go to our form picker component. This is the picker component we use in a form. So it comes with an error message. Now we need to give this component a new prop width and then pass it to the underlying picker component. Super easy. We set width to width. And the final step, we go to app picker. Now we give this component a new prop width, and note that I have sorted these props. So look at the code. Looks really easy to read. Finally, here we should remove the hard-coded width and apply it dynamically. So here's our container. We should wrap this object with an array and pass a second object with the width property. And just like before, we want to give this width a default value of 100%. Save, and here's the final result. That's much better. Now we want to take this picker to the next level. So when we tap on it, instead of seeing this flat list of items, we want to have a beautiful list of categories with colorful icons. So let's go to app.picker.js. Here we have a flat list to render a bunch of picker items. Now there are two ways to solve this problem. We can go to this component, give it a bunch of styles, we can give it an icon, but there is a problem with this approach. Maybe somewhere else in our app, we want to have a picker with a flat list of items. We don't want to have colorful icons. So we want our application's architecture to be flexible. So I'm going to create a new picker item component. Let's call that category picker item. Now over here, instead of being tightly coupled to this particular component, we want to have the flexibility to determine what kind of picker item should be used to render this list. So we want to give this component a new prop. I'm going to call that picker item component. Look at the naming convention. So the first letter of every word is uppercase. That means we should pass a component here. Okay. Now, back to our list. I'm going to replace picker item with picker item component. With this change, the consumer of the app picker component can specify the type of picker item to use. Okay. Now, to make sure we haven't broken anything, we want to give this prop a default value. So if somewhere we don't specify the type of picker item component, we want to use picker item by default. Okay. Let's save the changes. Let's test our app one more time. I haven't broken anything. I just added a prop, picker item component, and initialize it to picker item. And down below, in our flat list, instead of picker item, we are using this prop, picker item component. Okay. Now we have to go to app form picker component. This is the component that combines our app picker with an error message. So we need to give this component a new prop as well. So picker item component. Now, whatever we get here, we should pass it to our app picker. So here we set picker item component to picker item component. Okay. Now let's save the changes. Okay. All our props are sorted, beautiful. Now finally, let's go to our listing edit screen. Here's where we are using our picker. So let's set picker item component to. Now we need to create a new component. So back in our project, here in the components folder, I'm going to add a new file. Let's call this category picker item. Now here's a function component. For now, I just want to return null. So if we use this component, we're not going to see anything. Okay. Save the changes. Back to our listing edit screen. Here we're going to use category picker item. With this change, when I tap on our category picker, we're not going to see any items in our modal. Take a look. Save. So all the items disappeared. Let's try it one more time. So this verifies that we could successfully specify the type of picker item component. This is what I call flexible architecture. So if you design your components properly, you can always replace them. You can combine them and make more complex components. So we're done with this step. Next, we're going to work on the category picker item component. Now we're ready to implement the category picker item component. Let's start with the props. What props do we need here? Well, let's go to our app picker component. This is where we're going to use our picker item component. So this component should have two props, label and onPress. So let's add them over here, label and onPress. So both this component and the original picker item component, they have the same API. They have the same interface. Both these components support these two props. Okay. Now, here I'm going to start with a view. This acts as a container. So let's import the style sheet module right away and create our styles. Next, we set the style to styles.container. Now inside this container, we need an icon and a label. So let's use our icon component. This gives us an icon with a background color. So let's set background color and the name of the icon. Now, where do we get these values from? There are two solutions here. We can add them as props here, but the problem with this approach is that we have to go back to our app picker and specify the background color and the name of the icon name. Now, why is this bad? Well, these props only make sense in our category picker item component. As I told you before, both this component and the original picker item component, they should have the same interface, so we can reuse them the same way. So back to our app picker component, I'm going to delete these two props. Instead, I'm going to give this a new prop that is general and reusable, that is item, and we set it to the item that we're going to render. So it makes perfect sense that whenever we want to render a picker item component, we should know what item we want to render. Now, this item is an object. It can have a bunch of properties. It can have background color. It can have an icon and so on. With this approach, here we are not adding props that only make sense in the context of a category picker item component. Okay? So save the changes. Back to our category picker item. Here we add a new prop item. For consistency, we can go to our picker item component and add that new prop here. With this change, we no longer need the label because we can get it from the item, right? So we're simplifying the interface of this component. So let's render item.label, okay? Now back to the category picker item component. Again, we don't need the label, so now we only have two props. Beautiful. So let's get the background color from the item and the name from the item as well. So we set this to item.icon, okay? Save. So here's our icon. Let's also set the size to 80. Now, after the icon, we need a label. So I'm going to use our app text component. And here we render item.label. Pretty straightforward. Let's test our implementation up to this point. So save the changes. Back in our app, tab. We get these black circles because we haven't specified the background color and icon for each item. So we go to our listing edit screen. This is where we're defining our categories. Let's give each category a background color. Let's say red and an icon. For now, I'm just going to use random background colors and icons. Later, I'm going to replace this with actual colors and icons. So let's set the background color to green and the icon to email. And one more time. Here I'm going to use the lock icon. Save the changes. Take a look. We're getting there. Now for our category screen, we don't want to lay these out vertically. We want to have multiple columns. We want to have a grid of categories. How do we do that? Well, we go to our app picker component. This flat list has a prop we haven't talked about. It's called num columns. Let's set it to 3 and see what happens. So now we have 3 columns, but we don't want to hard code 3 here because this only makes sense for our category screen. Somewhere else in our app, we just want to show a flat list of items. So we should set this dynamically where we are using our app picker component. So I'm going to set this to a new prop, number of columns. Now let's add this prop. So we add it over here, number of columns. That also means we should go to our app form picker and include that new prop here, number of columns. Yeah, here we simply pass this prop to our app picker. So number of columns equals number of columns. Now it's good to give this a default value. So back to our app picker, I'm going to set this to 1. So by default, we're going to have a single column. But in our listing edit screen, we're going to have 3 columns. So let's see where we are using our picker. Here it is. Here we're going to set number of columns to 3. Save the changes. Now everything works perfectly. So let's improve the styling of this component. I'm going to apply some padding here. So we go to our category picker item. In this container, Let's set a padding horizontal of 30 pixels and a padding vertical of 15 pixels and see what happens. That looks better. Now look at the alignment of labels. They're not centered. So in this container, we should set align items to center. The reason I use this property here is that by default, flex direction of this container is set to the vertical axis. And here we want to align these components along the horizontal axis. So that is the secondary axis, which means we should use the align items property. Okay. Now this label is so close to the icon. So let's give it a style. I'm going to set margin top to 5 pixels. And then we apply the style over here. Let's take a look. Here's the final result. That looks pretty good to me. So now I'm going to pause the recording and replace these icons and their background color. Here's what we get. It's a lot better. Now there's a tiny problem in the last row. Because we have a long label, this view, this container, has grown larger than the others. So these two containers are pushed to the right. Fixing this problem is very easy. Here are the styles for our container. So we set the width to 33%. Take a look. The problem's gone. Now look at the label. Currently it's left aligned. I would like to make it center aligned. So here we apply text align to center. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now one last thing before we finish this lesson. Let's go back to our listing edit screen. Let's see what happens if we don't specify this custom picker item component. I'm also going to set the number of columns to the default, which is 1. We get this error because we cannot change the number of columns dynamically. So we have to manually reload the app. Now, if we don't supply our custom picker item component, this is what we get. Let's talk about the name of our components. So earlier I told you that it's best to prefix our components names with app to prevent name conflicts. This is an approach that a lot of people in the React Native community follow. But to be honest with you, I personally don't follow this myself because the whole purpose of namespaces or packages is to prevent name conflicts. So we can have two objects or functions or classes with the same name but in different packages. That's perfectly fine. The reason I didn't tell you this earlier in the course was that I wanted to minimize the chances of you getting stuck while following the course. For example, let's say we call this component text input instead of app text input. Now you could accidentally import the text input in the React Native core, and then you wouldn't get the same result as me in the videos. Simple things like that can often get overlooked by beginners. But now that you're fairly confident with the tooling and React Native code, let me show you how I personally like to name these components. I'm going to rename one component as an example and show you a simple technique. Then I'm going to pause the video and rename the other components. So I'm going to rename this file. So here we press enter and remove app. We just go open this file, app form field, because here we have a reference to this component. So the path is updated. Good. Let's save the changes. Now, in our text input component, we should still call this app text input because in this component, we are importing the text input of React Native. So if we call this text input, and because we're using text input over here, we'll end up with an infinite loop. This wouldn't work. So in this file, we should still call this component app text input, but we rename the file to text input. Now we go to where we're using this component, like app form field, and here we manually rename this component. So we press F2 and rename this to text input. I think that's better, that's cleaner, but if you prefer a prefix, that's perfectly fine. Going forward, I'm going to stick with short and clean names. All right, here's the end result. In our forms package, we have form, form field, and form picker. I prefer these names to, let's say, app form picker. And in our components folder, we have button, picker, text, and text input. One more thing I want to show you in this section is how to create a code snippet to increase your productivity. So in the components folder, let's add a new file called test.js. If you have noticed, every time we create a component, there are a number of steps we have to complete. First, we have to create a function component. Now, most of the time, our components start with a view. So here we have to add a view. Now, most of the time, our views need a style. So we have to import the style sheet module on the top and then create our styles object. See, so many steps we have to follow. Now here we create a bunch of styles for our container and then apply them over here. Styles.container. So these are the steps that we have to complete to create a new component. Now, wouldn't that be nicer if you could create this component using a single shortcut? Let me show you how to do that. So I'm not going to save the changes because the moment I do this, Printer is going to reformat the code and by default, it's going to replace this single quotes with double quotes. Now, there is nothing wrong with double quotes. I know some people hate them. I don't. But in this video, I really need single quotes. You'll see why in a second. So to create a custom snippet, we go to the code menu on the top. If you're on Windows, you're going to see the file menu. Now we go to preferences and then user snippets. Here we select the language for which we want to create a snippet. So I'm going to go with JavaScript. We also have JavaScript React, but that would be enabled if we use the JSX file extension. In this project, we use the JS extension, okay? Now over here, you can see a sample of a code snippet. If this is confusing, just Google VS Code code snippets. Read the documentation, it's super easy, but let me show you how to create a code snippet in this video. So first we add a key value pair. The key is a string. Here we can use a label like function component. It doesn't really matter. We set it to an object. In this object, we should have a couple of properties. The first one is prefix. We set this to RNFC. This is the shortcut that will activate our code snippet. So I typed RNFC here. That is short for React Native Function Component. Now, next we set body to an array of strings. This is where we define the body of our code snippet. So we have to go back to our test.js file and copy it line by line. And this is why I told you here I really need a single quote, because if you had double quotes, our code here would get more complicated. So let's add a string here and then paste the first line. We add a second string. Now back to our test file, we're going to copy the second line and paste it over here. So we're defining the body exactly the way it should appear when we use this shortcut, using the same formatting. That means over here, the next line is an empty line. So here we have to pass an empty string, okay? Now the fourth line. So I'm going to pause the recording and copy these lines into my JSON file line by line. So here's the end result. We have two import statements, an empty line, our function component with its return statement. Note that all the indentation and formatting is there exactly like our original code. Now, we want to change the name of this function component. We don't want it to be called test. We want to set this based on the name of the current file. So here we're going to use one of the predefined variables. We type $, and in braces we type tm underline file name underline base. Now I'm going to copy this. We're going to repeat this down below, where we're exporting this component. Okay, now the last step. When we create this code snippet, we want our cursor to be right here because that's where we're going to start typing. So here we type $0. Okay, let's save the changes. Now, back to this file. I'm going to delete everything. Let's type RNFC, and here's our function component. So this is how we can create a code snippet. Really easy. Now, I've attached this JSON file to this lesson, so you can use my code snippet in case you didn't do all the typing. So we have reached the end of part 1, but please watch this short video to the end because I want to talk to you about something real quick. Let's look at what I promised you the day you enrolled. So here's the sale page of the course. I told you that in this course, you will learn how to use the essential tools for React Native development. You'll learn how to structure your projects, how to run and debug your apps, how to troubleshoot common errors. You also learn how to work with the core components and APIs, build layouts with Flexbox, build reusable components, apply beautiful styles to your components, get input from the user, build forms with Formic, implement validation with Yup, publish your apps to Expo, apply the best practices, write clean code like a pro, and use my favorite shortcuts to write code fast. This is what I promised you at the beginning of this journey, and I believe I've delivered what I promised. So I would really appreciate it if you support me by telling others about this course. Your friends, your coworkers, anyone who wants to learn React Native. Please tell them about this course and how much you learn. And if you want to support my hard work even more, please send a tweet and tell others about your experience with this course. These days, we're all bombarded with so much information out there. There are tons of tutorials, books, and courses. So if someone wants to learn React Native, they don't know where to start. You have probably tried many of these books and courses. You know that a lot of them are just super long, repetitive, and they don't teach you how to build a real, full-fledged app. They waste hours of your time just to teach you how to build a calculator or a guessing game. So if you love this course, please mention in your tweet why you loved it. This is really important to me and other people. So if you can do this for me, please make sure to mention me and include the React Native hashtag so I get notified. Now, I want to say thank you for watching this course to this point and allowing me to be your instructor. I hope you have learned a lot, but we're not done yet. In the next part, we're going to take this app to the next level. We're going to talk about using native features, calling APIs, authentication, push notifications, and much, much more. So I hope to see you in the next part.